All right. Just to flag that tomorrow there will be we'll have a guest, and that will be our good friend Massimo Torero, the chief economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization. He will be here to brief you virtually on the conflict in the Middle East and the implication for global food security or global food insecurity. Also, want to flag that there's an exhibit opening today in the visitors lobby entitled "A History Exposed: The Enslavement of Black People in Canada." This exhibit was done through a collaboration between the outreach program of the UN's Department of Global Communications on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, the Government of Canada, and the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. And that Pier 21 is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, a beautiful place. If you are interested, you're invited tonight at the opening at 6:15. The exhibit is timed with the International Day of the Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and that is tomorrow. And also tomorrow, the Secretary General will take part in the General Assembly's commemoration of that day, and that will start at 10 a.m. And we will we will share those remarks with you. The keynote speaker tomorrow will be the Barbadian poet Esther Phillips, who is the first poet laureate of Barbados. And the youth speaker will be Shahada Jack, the first youth poet laureate of Toronto, Canada. And later this afternoon at 3 p.m. In the Security Council, there will be an open briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. Our Deputy Special Coordinator and Resident Coordinator at the Office of the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Dr. Ramiz Alakbarov, is expected to brief, and he will be briefing on the implementation of Resolution 2334, which is related to settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. And just for your information, Nickolay Mladenov, the Board of Peace High Representative to Gaza, is also expected to brief in the Council, and he'll be briefing on the implementation of Resolution 2803, which endorsed the U.S. Comprehensive Plan to End the Gaza Conflict. That resolution was adopted last November. Meanwhile, things are happening on the ground, and those are persistent challenges that remain and are preventing us and our NGO partners from fully responding to people's needs in Gaza. Since the reopening of the Rafah crossing last Thursday, the World Health Organization and its partners have supported the medical evacuation of 16 patients who needed treatment that was unavailable in Gaza, along with 30 of their companions. The UN teams have also offered services to some 20 returnees. That support was provided on Thursday and Sunday with a scheduled break over the weekend. Dr. Alakbarov, meanwhile, who will be briefing from Jerusalem, continues to engage with authorities to ensure that the voluntary movements of people in and out of Gaza can continue in safety and in dignity and in accordance with international humanitarian law. Our support to medical evacuation returnees is scheduled to resume on Thursday this week. Karim Abu Salam remains the only operational crossing for humanitarian and commercial cargo to enter the Gaza Strip. We once again call for the opening of additional crossings and the lifting of restrictions on humanitarian operations for ourselves and our NGO partners. Speaking of our NGO partners, and we have been informed that a recent court case in Israel has rejected the appeal by our NGO partners to continue to operate. As we've said many times before, it is near impossible for us to do our work without those NGO partners, international and others. And in the West Bank, our OCHA colleagues warned that harsh humanitarian impact of settler attacks against Palestinians and are continuing. Over the past few days, our field teams have recorded multiple attacks by settlers that resulted in casualties, property damage, and displacement among Palestinians, including most recently in Batna al-Hawa in Silwan neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Evictions, demolitions, and violence have grave physical, social, and economic and emotional impact and deepens reliance on humanitarian support. Palestinians must be protected and perpetrators must be brought to justice. Moving north to Lebanon, where we, of course, are continuing to watch with grave concern the escalating rhetoric and the ongoing hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel. More than 1 million people, including nearly 370,000 children, are now registered in the country as displaced. Our humanitarian colleagues on the ground tell us that strikes have been reported across Lebanon, with airstrikes overnight in Beirut's southern suburbs, following further mass displacement orders across multiple neighborhoods. In southern Lebanon, at least 7 key crossings over the Litani rivers were struck in the past week, restricting people's movement and hindering humanitarian aid from reaching people fleeing the violence. We and our humanitarian partners are continuing to respond to growing needs. We continue to provide food, we continue to provide shelter, as well as medical care and protection support to families who are forced to flee the fighting. As of yesterday, the World Food Program and its partners distributed 1.7 million hot meals and 50,000 ready-to-eat kits. Our partners working in education protection are also helping displaced children by providing psychosocial support, recreational activities, and alternative ways of learning for children. We reiterate that there is simply no military solution to the conflict and continue to call for de-escalation and urge all sides to avail themselves of the diplomatic channels available to them and to recommit to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. Our special coordinator, Janine Hennis-Plasschaert, is pursuing all avenues of dialogue to this end. Turning to Sudan, I wanted to flag that our newly minted personal envoy for Sudan, Pekka Haavisto, is in Khartoum today. He's so far met with senior Sudanese officials, including the foreign minister, Salam. He's also expected to meet with the chairman of the Sovereign Council and commander of the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Al-Burhan. The personal envoy also aims to engage with a cross-section of Sudanese political and civil society actors, as well as the diplomatic community. He will travel to several capitals in the region in the coming weeks to continue his initial consultations in support of peace in Sudan. And peace is very elusive in Sudan, as we've been telling you, as the situation remains deeply concerning. Yesterday, we spoke about the devastating drone attack in Al Tain Teaching Hospital in East Darfur that took place on March 20th. And I can tell you that the Secretary General strongly condemns this attack, which killed at least 60 people, including children and health workers. Since the current war in Sudan began in April of 2023, the World Health Organization has verified more than 200 attacks harming health facilities in the country, resulting in more than 2,000 deaths. The Secretary General demands that all parties abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, which specifically protects medical personnel and specifically protects medical facilities and prohibits attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects. This is not the first time we've had to read these things aloud. He calls on the parties to immediately de-escalate the fighting and agree to a cessation of hostilities. Mr. Guterres renews his appeal to the parties to work with mediators, including Pekka Haavisto, his personal envoy, to return to the negotiating table to pursue a lasting ceasefire with a comprehensive, inclusive, and Sudanese-owned political process. We stand ready to support any genuine steps to end the fighting in Sudan. That statement has been shared with you. And just to give you a bit more alarming and tragic news from Sudan, our humanitarian colleagues are alarmed by the impact of escalating drone attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The UN Human Rights Office reported that between January and mid-March alone, some 500 civilians were reportedly killed in drone strikes. This illustrates so clearly the bloody and devastating impact of this increasingly accessible high-tech weaponry. In West Kordofan, local reports indicate that at least 17 people were killed and 25 others injured in drone strikes on residential neighborhoods in the town of Lagawa yesterday. In northern state, drone attacks in the town of Adaba on Friday reportedly killed a number of people and damaged an electricity substation, causing widespread power outage. And in Blue Nile State, local sources reported to us that more than 30 civilians were killed yesterday amid heavy fighting in Kurmuk town, which was surrounded and subjected to intense shelling and drone strikes. Some residents have reportedly fled across the border into Ethiopia. These incidents are just a few of the daily risks and suffering faced by civilians across the country. Once again, we reiterate that international humanitarian law, which cannot be cherry-picked, prohibits attacks against against civilians and civilians' objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks. We also renew our call to all parties to facilitate rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access for all those who need it. And apologies for continuing with horrendous news, but I want to turn to Haiti, a country that lies just 1,500 miles from these shores. A new report by our human rights colleagues details the human rights impacts of violence perpetrated in the country by gangs, by security forces, by private security contractors, and self-defense groups. According to data verified by the UN Human Rights Office, at least 5,519 people were killed in Haiti and 2,608 injured between March of 2025 and January 15th of this year. Gangs have terrorized the population by killings and by kidnapping people, by trafficking children, and by stealing at illegal checkpoints, by extorting money from businesses and destroying and ransacking public and private properties. These gangs have also targeted individuals perceived as cooperating with the police or just people who appear to be defying the gang's authority. The report also finds that between March and December of last year, at least 1,571 women and girls were victims of sexual violence, mostly gang rape. Others, including children, were coerced into so-called sentimental relationships with gang members and subjected to prolonged sexual exploitation and abuse. Our human rights colleagues documented instances of unnecessary or disproportionate use of force by the police, as well as violence perpetrated by self-defense groups and mobs engaging in so-called popular justice. They also report that since March 2025, a private military company reportedly hired by the government of Haiti has taken part in security operations, including drone strikes and helicopter gunfire. Our colleagues say no investigation appears to have been opened by the judicial authorities to establish the legality of these operations and circumstances in which killings and injuries occurred. The report acknowledges some progress in the functioning of the justice system, but our human rights colleagues also called for further efforts to bolster the rule of law in Haiti. The full report is available online. It is grim reading, but I encourage you to read it and report on it. Turning to Colombia, and to stay in the region, the UN mission in Colombia and the UN country team expressed sadness over the tragic crash of a military transport plane in southern Colombia yesterday. They extend their solidarity and condolences to the families of the victims and the government and people of Colombia. They also wish all those injured a speedy recovery. And of course, we join the UN mission and our team in Colombia in extending our heartfelt condolences. And our emergency relief coordinator, Tom Fletcher, has allocated $10.5 million from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund to help people ahead of the severe drought across the so-called dry corridor in Central America, along the coast of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Our humanitarian colleagues note that communities, many of them subsistence farmers, face failing crops, rising food insecurity, and growing pressures on their livelihoods. The new funding will allow OCHA and our partners to take anticipatory action to act to reduce humanitarian needs, to protect jobs, and help families stay ahead of any shock. Some 150,000 people across the three countries will receive cash to purchase food, seeds resistant to drought and livestock feed, as well as health support and water and sanitation services. Quick note from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the UN Refugee Agency is telling us that following the reopening of the Burundi DRC border at the end of last month, more than 33,000 Congolese refugees have spontaneously returned from Burundi to eastern DRC. where conditions, as we've been telling you, remain extremely fragile. UNHCR says many returnees found their homes destroyed and belongings looted, leaving them unable to resume a normal life without substantial support. You'll recall that thousands of Congolese people had fled to Burundi in December of last year because of the increased fighting between the Congolese armed forces and the M23 armed group. Our UNHCR colleagues are calling for urgent support. Funding assistance in the DRC is currently 34% funded. Meanwhile, the appeal for the remaining 109,000 Congolese refugees in Burundi is only 20% funded. And yesterday afternoon, the Security Council members met on Ukraine, where they heard from Rosemary DiCarlo, our Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. She noted that the suffering and destruction caused by the war in Ukraine can never be justified, stressing that a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire is imperative. Also briefing council members was Tom Fletcher, our head of humanitarian operations. He said that over a cruel and cold winter, around 100 humanitarian organizations supported more than 1.6 million people, noting that the 2026 humanitarian needs and response plan requires $2 billion to reach 3.6 million of the most vulnerable people, but nearly three-quarters of that plan is still unfunded. And today marks the International Day for the right to the truth concerning gross human rights violations and for the dignity of victims. The right to the truth applies to serious human rights violations and grave breaches of humanitarian law, affirming families' rights to know what happened, including the circumstances, reasons, and those responsible. And today is also World Tuberculosis Day. TB remains one of the world's deadliest infectious diseases, with more than 29,000 new cases each and every day. The World Health Organization urges countries to accelerate action to end TB and expand access to life-saving treatment. Speaking of life-saving treatment, Edie.
Thank you, Steph. I believe today that the Israeli defense minister said that Israel plans to resend troops into southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River, which the Israelis ordered emptied. Does the Secretary General have any comment on this?
This is part of the increased rhetoric that is very much concerning to us. I think this is the last thing we would want to see. This is the last thing the Lebanese people in the south would want to see. What we need is for Israel, for Hezbollah, and all other parties to fully implement Security Council Resolution 1701, as there is no military solution to this conflict.
And on Sudan, does the United Nations know who is carrying out these drone attacks?
Look, we don't have the forensic capability to do it. But what we have seen is that there have been drone attacks on places that were in the hands of the RSF and in the hands of the government, which leads us to believe that both parties have been using drones. Now more than Gabriel.
Thank you, Stéphane. One question on Iraqi Kurdistan. The Kurdistan regional government says that a ballistic missile strike from Iran has killed 6 of its Peshmerga forces and wounded dozens of others. This effectively makes the Kurdistan region basically Iran's deadliest retaliatory strikes against its neighbors has happened in that region in northern Iraq. What does the Secretary General have to say on this?
This is part of the worrying, not only ongoing, but extension of this conflict. As we mentioned yesterday, we've heard reports that there were discussions going on, and those discussions need to lead to an end to this war. Gabriel.
Thanks, Steph. You've probably seen the reports of a potential diplomatic movement in Pakistan regarding the potential talks to end the conflict in Iran, in the region. What does the Secretary General think about Pakistan possibly being a mediator, and does the UN foresee any potential role there in any way?
Look, Secretary General, as he said, is always available to the parties to assist as he is in any conflict. He remains engaged on the issues surrounding Strait of Hormuz, as he has said. I think any country, any combinations of countries that can help to bring the U.S. and Iran together to lead to an end of this conflict is welcome. Alex, you raising your hand?
Thanks, Steph. Firstly, has the Secretary General met with Mr. Landau yesterday?
Yes, he met Mr. Landau yesterday. They discussed a number of UN-related issues, including UN reform and some peacekeeping issues, and basically discussed a number of files where the UN, the Secretariat, and the U.S. are working together.
Iran, Strait of Hormuz?
That's where I will leave it at.
All right. And secondly, has there been any contacts with Iranian mission, U.S. mission on possible negotiations? You asked for additional information.
There's nothing else that you will get from me.
Thanks.
Okay. Yes, Islam.
Thank you, Stéphane. I would like to follow up Edie's question. Israel Finance Minister Smotrich said, in quote, "The Litani River must be our new border with Lebanon, like the yellow line in Gaza and the buffer zone on Mount Hermon in Syria," end quote. Considering 1 million people who have been forced to flee from South Lebanon, does the Secretary General worry about Israel's new expansion or this rhetoric?
Yes, we worry about the increased rhetoric that we're seeing. We worry about the continuing military activity that we're seeing. The territorial integrity of Lebanon needs to be respected. The government of Lebanon needs to be respected, and the government's authority to have monopoly on the use of force and the use of arms throughout its country needs to be respected. We don't need more fighting. We don't need more rhetoric. I mean, already more than 1 million people on the move in Lebanon. Israeli civilians on the southern side of the Blue Line have also been impacted. There needs to be a return to negotiations, and there needs to be a return to the full implementation of Security Council 1701.
And if I may ask another question, multiple news outlets reported that Israeli soldiers tortured 1-year-old Palestinian child named Karim Abu Nassar in Gaza to pressure his father. The child reportedly suffered cigarette burns, marks, and nail wounds. Did you see this report, and do you have any comments?
The horrific description of that report, which clearly needs to be investigated. Reading it reading the report itself is just horrific. Linda.
Thank you, Steph. Could we possibly get some more information about Mr. Mladenov's briefing today?
We will. He does not work for the UN. We're in touch with his team to try to get his briefing, at least, to share with you. But I would encourage you to try to grab him at the stakeout.
But my question is this a regularly scheduled kind of briefing?
I mean, it's part of the
implementation.
It's part of the implementation of the resolution, as I recall.
Thank you.
Farnoosh?
Thanks, Steph. This may have been asked because I've been gone for a few days, but the Secretary General mentioned that he believes it's reasonable to believe that war crimes have been committed by both Iran and Israel in the past month of this war. I'm interested in both what examples he's talking about when he mentions those two countries and why the U.S. was not named, given the highly susceptible reports.
I think what he said, and I would encourage you to read the interview or listen to the podcast. He's basically saying there are potentially been crimes, war crimes being committed. It doesn't matter who commits those; they need to be investigated. He was referring in the interview to attacks on energy infrastructure. Gabriel.
Just a quick one. Mladenov is briefing the council at the request of the President, the U.S., or of the Secretariat?
Council, people invited to brief the council are invited by the presidency.
Right.
I mean, the secretary doesn't request outside briefers to come.
Fair enough.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. You're released from your duties.
Online questions.
Mr. Vacara, please. We will stay for you. We'll have a little coffee, a cigarette, and we'll listen to your question.
Well, okay. So President Trump often says the United Nations has great potential. Why doesn't the Secretary General ask him to mediate between the United States and Iran?
Why doesn't the Secretary General ask what?
Why hasn't the Secretary General asked him to take a mediating role between the US and Iran?
The Secretary, if I understand your question, you're asking me why the Secretary General hasn't spoken out and offered himself as a mediator. Is that your question?
Yes, but it's
Okay.
that because Trump is repeating, and anytime you ask a question about the United Nations, he says the United Nations has a lot of potentials.
Yes.
So
The
yeah.
Secretary General's good offices, and I've said this, I think, about 552 times, are available to all parties to any conflict should the parties involved in this conflict request it. On that note,
Follow up.
go ahead.
Yes. You answered this question not only from me but from anybody
Yes,
else.
exactly.
You ask
I mean,
always this, that you say always the door of the Secretary General is open, okay? But in a situation like this, there is a war going on. Shouldn't the Secretary General instead be more active? It means don't wait.
I think, Stefano, I think if you've, and I know you have followed this, the Secretary General has been involved with a number of parties related to the issue of the Strait of Hormuz and the fact that the impact and how to alleviate the situation around the Strait of Hormuz, to alleviate the situation of the most vulnerable in the most vulnerable countries, seeing the increase already in food prices and fertilizer prices. So I can tell you the Secretary General has not been sitting on his hands waiting for the phone to ring. Mr. Ali. You're muted. I can see you move, but I can't hear you. Iftikhar? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. My question has been asked, but has any of the parties, Iran, Pakistan, United States, officially informed the Secretary General about this possibility of these talks in Pakistan?
I have nothing to share with you on that at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.